This is another iRaw podcast.
Hi, I'm Amelia Leese, and welcome to the latest episode of Think Like a Vegan podcast, a companion to our book also entitled Think Like a Vegan. War harms all living things. I don't say this with a hippy-dippy peace and love attitude, but with a critical one, where I want to understand exactly how we, as a species, justify the things we do. I began exploring the entanglement of war and animals in season 2 of my podcast when Josh Milburn and Sara van Goozen were my guests. My guest today takes the analysis along the logical continuum, putting our actions relating to animals within the context of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Convention, and the additional protocols. She does so in an astonishing way. She's at once clinical in her analysis, devastating in her straightforward telling of facts, and incredibly sensitive to the real and lived experiences of people and animals. On today's episode, I'm thrilled to host Stacy Banwell. She's the author of The War Against Nonhuman Animals, a non-speciesist understanding of gendered reproductive violence, published by Palgrave Macmillan. And it's now in paperback, which makes it even more accessible. Welcome, Stacy.
Hi. Hi, Emmy. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I first heard Stacy talk on Josh Milburn's podcast, Knowing Animals, which I totally recommend, by the way. I usually listen to podcasts when I'm running, and her episode made me stop and rewind several times. It's not so much that the subjects she spoke about were new to me individually, but the way she put it all together and piece by piece made her case was masterful. And I love masterful arguments. After all, I'm a lawyer. I could also hear the influence of Professor Manisha Dekka and her work on animals as legal beings. Manisha was my guest in season 1, and if you've not yet listened to that one, I urge you to do so. Stacy is also incredibly sensitive to avoiding the pitfalls of the dreaded comparison, which is something I too try to avoid in my writing. The dreaded comparison happens when we directly compare human experiences to those of non-human animals. Nothing good ever comes from the dreaded comparison. And immediately, not only do we alienate our audience, but we also don't examine or explain the issues clearly. What happens is we use the imagery of the horrible things which have happened to people to do all the heavy intellectual lifting and thereby re-victimize the victims, instead of using our critical analysis skills to explain the issues, draw out the connections, and identify the shared sources of oppression. Stacy's book deals with this head-on, and that section of her book is possibly the best elucidation of the concept and how to avoid it that I've ever read. The aim of her book, she writes, is to embrace the existence of multiple forms of oppression and the interconnectedness between them. Stacy Banwell is an associate professor of criminology at the University of Greenwich in the UK. She has a long list of publications, in addition to the book we'll be hearing about today, and many focused on gender violence, whether during war or armed conflict or otherwise, including the Emerald International Handbook of Feminist Perspectives on Women's Act of Violence, Sex and Crime, and the monograph, Gender and the Violences of War and Armed Conflict, More Dangerous to be a Woman? Stacy has released 2 tremendously effective animations on the Science Animate YouTube channel. One is entitled Gendered Wars and Gender-Based Violence, Who is Dangerous and Who is in Danger? And the second is Why is the War Against Nonhuman Animals a Crisis for Humans Too? Both are incredibly powerful, moving, and all are brilliantly explained in 2 minutes or less. I highly recommend watching them, and I'll link to them in the episode notes. Before we hear from Stacy, I want to read one powerful sentence from her book, which really sets the tone for today's episode. I believe non-human animals should be treated as civilians, and that existing protections within international humanitarian law should be applied to them as protected persons, not the property of protected persons. With that, Stacy, the floor is yours.
So, Dr. Melanie Joy's conversation about carnism on the Ezra Klein podcast in 2018 was the inspiration for writing the book. She was on the podcast to promote her book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs and Wear Cows. So in case people aren't familiar with the concept, carnism is a belief system in the same way that vegetarianism and veganism are, whereby eating animals is viewed as ethical and acceptable. It is considered the opposite of veganism. So during her conversation with Ezra, Joy informs listeners that, quote, more farmed animals are slaughtered in 1 week than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout human history, end quote. So not only was I alarmed and baffled by these numbers, I was also interested in a broader question. How is the slaughter of non-human animals different from the violences that take place during war and armed conflict? To put another way, are there grounds for placing the slaughter of non-human animals in the context of war? And as you can probably tell from the title of the book, my view is that it is possible, in fact necessary, to view the killing of non-human animals as an act of war. So according to Kochi in his article, Species War, determining the legitimacy of war involves answering the following questions. 1, what types of coercion, violence and killing may be included within the definition of war? 2, who may legitimately use coercion, violence and killing? And 3, what are the reasons and circumstances under which certain actors use coercion, violence, and killing? The book offers answers to all 3 questions. So during this episode, I'm going to run through some of the main themes and arguments of the book. So first, and obviously the main argument of the book, is that we are currently engaged in a war against non-human animals. While existing research on the relationship between non-human animals and war has focused on the use, exploitation and killing of non-human animals. So, for example, we can think about the edited collection Animals and War that was edited by Nokella, Salter and Bentley. I argue that war itself is being waged against non-human animals. So drawing inspiration from Dinesh Waddiwell's 2015 book, The War Against Animals, I offer practical and operational guidelines on how we might protect non-human animals from the violences of war. And I do so by offering an original analysis of non-international armed conflict as outlined in international humanitarian law. To put simply, the aim of international humanitarian law is to alleviate the impact of armed conflict by protecting civilians and restricting the means and methods used during conflict. So 2 types of armed conflict are recognized within international humanitarian law: international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict. I argue that the latter forms the basis of the war against non-human animals. And in the book, I explain in detail why this is the case. For now, however, let's focus on the criteria that needs to be met for non-international armed conflict, as outlined by Kathleen Lawland of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who notes, quote, fulfillment of these criteria is determined on a case-by-case basis by weighing up a number of factual indicators, end quote. So the criteria that the International Committee of the Red Cross lists in order for something to be classified as non-international armed conflict include things like the intensity, the duration, and the gravity of the violence, as well as the type of government forces, the weapons used, and the number of casualties incurred. So to illustrate the gravity of the violence of this species war, I provide readers with the latest figures on the global slaughter of non-human animals to argue that it meets this criteria around intensity and gravity. I did debate whether to include such detailed information in the book. So whilst I understood the importance of providing concrete and tangible evidence to support the argument I was making in the book, I did worry that such an approach would be counterproductive. Would highlighting the sheer scale of the violence overwhelm readers? Would this have a similar effect to fears around climate change in the form of eco-anxiety or climate anxiety, which can leave people feeling disempowered and disengaged. However, given the central thesis of the book, that we are currently engaged in a war against non-human animals, I decided that it was important to record the extent and nature of this violence. So, if we take the latest figures from Viva, this is the UK's leading vegan campaigning charity, we can see that annually 1.2 billion land animals are killed for meat in the UK, and over 1 billion fish and 4.4 billion shellfish are killed. So taking this information into account and the criteria that need to be met for non-international armed conflict, as outlined by the International Committee of the Red Cross, I believe we can, indeed should, revise the existing definition of non-international armed conflict. And this is the reformulation that I offer in the book. And it's what I use then throughout the rest of the book to make the other arguments. And that is, the war against non-human animals involves violence committed by government and non-governmental groups against non-armed, non-combatants, i.e. non-human animals within a state. So currently, international humanitarian law protects animals during armed conflict when they are classified as property. So just to elaborate, the destruction of non-human animals when they are classified as the private property of protected persons is considered a war crime and a breach of the Geneva Conventions. However, rather than view non-human animals as property, I believe non-human animals should be treated as civilians, and that existing protections within international humanitarian law should be applied to them as protected persons, not the property of protected persons. So this viewpoint and my reformulation of non-international armed conflict requires recognizing that non-human animals are sentient beings. This leads on to the second argument of the book, and that is non-human animals should be granted passive legal personhood. The book, A Criminology of War by McGarry and Warclate, reviews the feasibility of developing a criminology of war. To answer their question, they draw on Jameson, who states, quote, "What it comes down to is not so much a question of what people call it, rather it is a question of how the study of war is imagined and achieved," end quote. I imagine the study of war to include non-human animals. Following Flynn and Hall and their article, The Case for a Victimology of Non-Human Animals, I propose developing a victimology of non-human animals during war. To achieve this study of war, one must recognize non-human animals as sentient beings. As a group, we should be granted legal personhood and given fundamental rights such as bodily integrity and bodily liberty. So after reviewing the scientific and philosophical literature on animal sentience, as well as various policy documents, so in particular I look at the new UK Animal Welfare Sentience Bill, I proceeded on the following basis. All vertebrate and invertebrate non-human animals with brains and nervous systems should be regarded as sentient beings. Based on this, they should be granted legal personhood. So let's pause here for a second to consider this Animal Welfare Sentience Bill before I address this issue of legal personhood. So when I first started writing this chapter in the book, this was around September 2021, the Animal Welfare Sentience Bill was at the report stage in the House of Lords. However, as I was finishing the book, this bill was approved by Parliament. The new UK law is now referred to as the Animal Welfare Sentience Act 2022. So by law, the UK government must acknowledge animal sentience when drafting legislation. It also requires the provision of an Animal Sentience Committee appointed by the Secretary of State. The role of the committee will be to ask, quote, whether or to what extent the government is having or has had all due regard to the ways in which a policy might have an adverse effect on the welfare of animals as sentient beings, end quote. And that's taken from the Animal Welfare Sentience Act. Historically, non-human animal in this context was limited to any vertebrate other than Homo sapiens. So this meant fish, amphibians, reptile, birds, and mammals. However, the new legislation allows for the Secretary of State to amend this section and incorporate invertebrates of any description within the definition of non-human animal. So invertebrates include, but are not limited to, crabs, lobster, squid, jellyfish, as well as spiders, snails, insects, and clams. So I've provided these details to give listeners a sense of the scope of what we are talking about here when we consider the UK stance on animal sentience. So as I do with readers in the book, I'm now going to invite listeners, as a thought experiment, to agree that all non-human animals can suffer. Following this, let's now ask ourselves, what measures should we take to eliminate the pain and suffering of these non-human animals? In other words, what does treating non-human animals with care and respect look like? Does treating non-human animals with care and respect preclude us from treating them as resources? So simply put, what I'm trying to ask is, what protections does sentience offer? Ultimately, the question I am asking is, what is the relationship between sentience and legal personhood? Is an acknowledgement of sentience, as we now have with this UK bill, enough? Or does the problem lie with the continued property status of most non-human animals? And there were disagreements about granting non-human animals legal personhood. The details of these are beyond the scope of this podcast episode. I do deal with these at length in the book. Suffice to say, not everybody agrees that granting non-human animals legal personhood is the solution to addressing the current status of non-human animals as property or legal things. Following Kirky and his article, Legal Personhood and Animal Rights, I conclude that non-human animals should be granted certain incidents of passive legal personhood, specifically the right not to be harmed, the right to personal freedom, liberty, and bodily integrity. And this is in contrast to active legal personhood, which is based on rights and duties. Going further, I suggest that these arguments about legal personhood need to be placed within a broader discussion about humanity and what it means to be human. Several writers have questioned the category human and what it means to be human. And the overarching theme within this work is that the category human is constructed along racial, gendered, and speciesist lines. To put another way, discussions about what it means to be human are inseparable from discussions about racism, sexism, and speciesism. And as we know, in simple terms, speciesism refers to the perceived human superiority over non-human animals, or discrimination based on species membership. So some of this work will fall within critical animal studies. However, collectively and broadly speaking, I think these writers can be placed within the discourse of posthumanism. And of note, and Emmy mentioned this earlier, is the work of Manisha Decker. In particular, I'm thinking about her article, Animal Justice, Cultural Justice, a Posthumanist Response to Cultural Rights in Animals. So posthumanism, to borrow from Decker, questions the stability of the human subject that has been foundational to Western thought. And as well as challenging the hierarchical binary between humans and non-human animals, posthumanism provides a way for us to try and aim at non-violence, compassion, ethics, and justice for all human and non-human animals. So to challenge racism, sexism, and speciesism, I argue that we must, from a posthumanist perspective, reconfigure what it means to be human. This means recognizing that the project before us is not an extensionist one, i.e., it does not simply involve expanding the definition of human to include those who have hitherto been excluded. Rather, the task is a reconstructive one. We must reimagine humans and non-human animals alike outside of systems of domination and oppression. In her book, Becoming Human, Matter and Meaning in an Anti-Black World, Jackson asks, quote, "What might we gain from the rupture of the human?" I believe the answer, from a post-humanist perspective, is a reappraisal of the human and non-human animal aimed at non-violence against both.
We'll pause for a musical interlude, after which we'll return with more from Stacy Banwell. I'm delighted to welcome back the music of Matthew Gerstenberger, aka Seismicity, on SoundCloud. He's a seismologist and vegan. He also provided all the musical breaks in season 2. This is Gin Regret. Matthew says, "I love textures and drones. There is no other music that can create positive emotions and sensations for me like they can. This was originally a long-form piece, and it was a challenge to cut it down to keep a sample of the textures. We're back for the second part of Stacy Banwell's War Against Animals.
So let's now consider the third argument of the book. War crimes and crimes against humanity are committed against human and non-human animals during war and armed conflict. So, war crimes are listed in international humanitarian law. They include rape, forced pregnancy, and any other form of sexual violence that breach the Geneva Conventions. Crimes against humanity refer to a range of acts that are committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population. This includes, but is not limited to, rape, forced pregnancy, or any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity. So these acts are framed as the expressions and consequences of reproductive violence. By reproductive violence, I mean violence that is directed against an individual due to their reproductive capabilities. It's violence that violates a person's reproductive autonomy. So the examples that I explore in the book include acts such as forced impregnation, forced pregnancy, forced adoption, forced ejaculation, castration, and enforced sterilization. So to review these war crimes and crimes against humanity, I draw on case studies of intrahuman violence, so that is violence between humans, as well as the violence that takes place on factory farms. So whenever I discuss this theme of the book, I always try to address head-on any potential concerns that readers or listeners might have with a book that chooses to address reproductive violence committed against human and non-human animals. Indeed, I go to great lengths to reassure readers from the outset that my intention is not to draw crude comparisons across the case studies chosen for analysis. Put simply, this book does not engage in dreaded comparisons. In case people are not familiar with this work, I will spend a few minutes just running through some of these dreaded comparisons. So in 1988, Marjorie Spiegel published a book called The Dreaded Comparison, Human and Animal Slavery. In it, as the title suggests, she draws parallels between the oppression of Black people and the oppression of non-human animals. Other examples include Eternal Treblinka, Our Treatment of Animals and the Holocaust by Charles Patterson, and The Holocaust and the Handmaid's Tale, A Case for Comparing Atrocities by Karen Davis. This and other dreaded comparisons that I review in the book draw on atrocity analogies, slavery analogies, and comparisons between violence against women and violence against non-human animals. So readers and listeners may wonder why I chose to include these details. Well, firstly, I wanted to demonstrate how my book does not fall within this trend. While it does include the experiences of both human and non-human animals, it does not engage in a direct hierarchical comparison between the two. And secondly, given the controversial nature of these dreaded comparisons and the continued use and defense of such analogies, I wanted to think about how we can move beyond divisive and alienating tactics. I wanted to explore avenues that allow us to acknowledge the similarities that stem from the sources of the oppression, while simultaneously respecting the distinct and unique experiences of the different groups that I was considering. And I think a really good starting point is to adopt Kim's notion of a multi-optic vision. In her book, Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age, Kim explains that a multi-optic vision, quote, is a way of seeing that takes disparate justice claims seriously without privileging anyone presumptively, end quote. So in contrast to a single optic vision, which focuses on one form of injustice while obscuring others, a multi-optic vision embraces the existence of multiple forms of oppression and the interconnectedness between them. So let's return to the case studies included in the book. So I included case studies of intrahuman violence alongside cases of violence against non-human animals for two main reasons. First, I wanted to demonstrate how non-human animals, when granted passive legal personhood, meet the criteria outlined in war crimes and crimes against humanity. To do this, it was necessary to establish the nature and the targets of this reproductive violence. So with regards to intrahuman violence and the female reproductive body, rape, forced pregnancy, and assault on motherhood was the nature of the violence. And the examples that I draw upon include rape and sexualized violence against Jewish women during the Holocaust, as well as rape, forced pregnancy, and sexual violence against Bengali women during the 1971 Liberation War. These cases of intrahuman violence also uncovered the targets of this violence, and that is, persons capable of becoming pregnant. So in terms of the war against non-human animals, I demonstrate how cows, sows, and hens are also subject to rape, forced pregnancy, and assault on motherhood within the meat and dairy industries. So across these case studies of human and non-human animals, I identified the following shared sources of oppression: patriarchy and the control of the reproductive body, motherhood, and the denial of personhood. So if we take the final theme, this idea of denial of personhood, my analysis revealed that reproductive violence involves the dehumanization of human groups, i.e. the removal of their humanity, while human exceptionalism, or speciesism if you prefer, and the treatment of non-human animals as things or as property drives the violence of the factory farm. In both cases, the denial of personhood is the kind of root source of the violence. And in terms of sexual reproductive violence against men, the nature of this intrahuman violence included genital violence, forced ejaculation, castration, and enforced sterilization. So using the examples of the 1971 Liberation War and the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia and Darfur, I identified the targets of this violence as bodies capable of procreation through semen production. And in terms of the war against non-human animals, I demonstrate how bulls and male calves are subject to forced ejaculation, castration, and enforced sterilization within the meat and dairy industries. And I outline the following shared sources of oppression between these two groups: the vulnerability of the penis, displacement from gendered personhood, race, and animalization. So let's focus on the vulnerability of the penis. In their article on this topic, Clark urges us to think of the penis in two opposite yet related ways: as a weapon that harms and as an object that is harmed. Here it's useful to draw on Zarkov, who wrote a chapter called The Body of the Other Man, Sexual Violence and the Construction of Masculinity. And with reference to the penis, he states, quote, "The power to provide, to protect and to defend, as well as to control and to define one's belonging to the ethnic group, is symbolically invested in men." In other words, the symbolic and material representation of the penis and its ability to reproduce the nation was the driving force for the reproductive violence committed against men in the case studies that I reviewed. So let's now consider the war against non-human animals. Within factory farming, bull semen is used to artificially inseminate cows. Their semen is collected via forced ejaculation, and two methods are used to forcibly ejaculate the bull: an artificial vagina or electro-ejaculation. And here we can return to Zarkov's statement about men's power to provide. In this context, in the context of male bulls, it is their power to provide, i.e. their reproductive capabilities through semen production, that underpins the forced ejaculation that they are subject to. During war and armed conflict, male-directed sexual and reproductive violence reveals the vulnerability of the penis. This, I argue, applies to human and non-human animals alike. In both cases, the penis, through its literal and symbolic function, is the source of the oppression. So at this point, readers might be thinking, but these are two very different situations, and it's not possible to compare the two. Well, that's the point. I'm not trying to draw comparisons or identify similarities between these situations. In fact, as I point out in the book, the experiences are unique and have different motivations. For example, if we go back to thinking about women and girls, fear often explains why women and girls are targeted during war and armed conflict, while productivity drives the reproductive violence committed against non-human animals. So to reiterate, my intention is not to draw crude, distasteful comparisons between these two groups, as is common within dreaded comparisons. Rather, my work draws attention to the shared sources of oppression across human and non-human animals, with the aim of ending violence against all persons subject to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Because as the book demonstrates, humans and non-human animals alike have and continue to be oppressed, exploited, and denied basic rights vis-a-vis their personhood status. In the final chapter of the book, I review the sites where the war against non-human animals takes place. Factory farms, which are referred to as concentrated animal feeding operations in the US, and mega farms in the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world. And this leads me on to the fourth argument of the book, and that is, the animal industrial complex results in global negative public health and environmental outcomes. Nosk coined the term animal industrial complex to refer to the industrialized domination and exploitation of non-human animals as commodities in capitalist societies. So within this final chapter, I review the impact of the animal industrial complex. I demonstrate how the nature of factory farming poses serious public health concerns, environmental pollution, increased risk of disease, viruses, infections, and antibiotic resistance. So if we go back to Kochi's second question, which is, who may legitimately use coercion, violence, and killing during the war against non-human animals? My response is this. Those who may legitimately use this violence are individuals at the state and institutional levels and individual actors within the intensive animal farming industry. However, it is really important to distinguish between those who run these industries and those who work within them. So in the book, I write about the emotional and physical harm experienced by factory and slaughterhouse workers who earn poverty wages to perform dangerous and traumatic jobs. Indeed, despite the routinized and systematic nature of the work, the exploitation and slaughter of non-human animals is up close and personal. It is stressful and unpleasant and poorly paid work. So I draw on research conducted by Human Rights Watch when discussing the impact on factory farm workers as well as slaughterhouse workers. In this chapter, I also draw comparisons between the impact of the meat, egg, and dairy industries with the impact of non-dairy and vegan alternatives, in the hope that it will inspire people to reduce their consumption of non-human animal products. The final theme of the book runs throughout all 5 chapters of the book, and that is racism, sexism, and speciesism inform the violences experienced by human and non-human populations during war and armed conflict. In March 2022, I visited the Francis Bacon exhibition, Man and Beast, at the Royal Academy of Arts. The exhibition features 3 of Bacon's subversive portraits of Pope Innocent X, all depicting the Pope like a caged animal. In one of the images, for example, the Pope appears to be screaming like a wild animal. These paintings are included in a section titled The Animal Within, and the accompanying text reads, Bacon's portraits strip away the pretensions of even the highest stations in society, with the implications that status or success, i.e. the trappings of civilization, are merely a thin, fragile veneer distinguishing us from our non-human counterparts. Put simply, these portraits challenge human exceptionalism. Despite Bacon's fascination with non-human animals, Bacon was not an animal rights advocate. Nevertheless, from the paintings on display, what seems evident is that Bacon was intent on blurring the distinction between man and beast. For Frankel, in his review of the Man and Beast exhibition in Time Out, this exhibition, quote, was a huge, daunting, breathtaking show filled with violence and blood, end quote. He correctly observes that the images on display leave you feeling uncomfortable and physically affected by what you've seen. Bacon, he argues, quote, makes you lose faith in humanity, in our morality and culture and superiority. You can dress it up any way you like, but in the end, we're all just animals, end quote. In these final lines, Frankl both rejects and reinforces human exceptionalism. In his acceptance of the fallacy of human superiority, he ironically still manages to confer a lesser status on non-human animals. Humans, he argues, are nothing more than animals. For me, his words uphold this human-non-human animal divide. Throughout the book, I challenge human exceptionalism and compartmentalized approaches to tackling racism, sexism, and speciesism. Indeed, from the outset, the book urges readers to adopt a multi-optic vision to, one, embrace multiple forms of oppression across human and non-human populations, and two, realize the interconnectedness between the sources of oppression. In other words, I argue that we must tackle the sources of oppression that intersect race, gender, and speciesism. And I identify these sources as white supremacy, patriarchy, and human exceptionalism. We can do this, as I do in the book, by recognizing how those subject to the expressions and consequences of reproductive violence are objectified and exploited for the following reasons. They have been identified as either persons capable of becoming pregnant or persons capable of procreation through semen production. The violence inflicted upon them is informed by racist and sexist discourses. And finally, the violence inflicted upon them removes their personhood, rendering and or confirming their ascribed status as sub, non, and inhuman. The reappraisal of our treatment of those rendered sub, non, and inhuman within white supremacy, alongside a post-humanist reimagining of the category human, is how I envision we end the war against non-human animals. So the book answers three questions. How do we tackle the violences of this war? How do we protect non-human animals from this species war? And who benefits from the dismantling of the carnist battlefield? And in order to find out the answers, I'm afraid listeners will have to read the book.
And they really should, because it's a tremendous work. Thank you so much, Stacy. The breadth of your work is huge, because you're tackling such a massive issue and such a massive subject, really, because it encompasses so many different things. But you do it so well, and you're always bringing it back to your point, and yet you even build on that and you make further connections. I loved the bit about Francis Bacon exhibit. I was like, oh my gosh, this is fantastic, because you're able to see the resonance of the topics in our sort of day-to-day life. And I found that to be particularly affecting. And going back to something that I'm a big believer in is the idea of animals as property, and why for me that's a fundamental. That's the fundamental issue as I see it. And you build on that, and you build on what Gary Francione has written and what Manisha Deka has written, that I see really as an evolution of Francione's initial and of his work. And you build on that, because you say, well, that's all well and good, but then what does that personhood look like? And you mentioned imagination a few times in this talk, and the reimagining of a world is so critical to making real profound change. And I wonder if you have any insights on that, or any feelings about imagination, and how sometimes that seems to be lacking, or sometimes people who do dare to imagine a different world get sort of called out. like, oh, you're being ridiculous.
Yes, yeah. And I think hopefully what I try to do in the book, and I said it at the outset there, was to make sure that it's, there is this aspirational nature, and like you say, trying to imagine a different world. But what I always bring it back to is looking at the way that we can do this kind of in an operational, practical way. So there are other people who've written about this, as I mentioned, Wadwell's work and Coach's work. And sometimes that work can just be like, it's a kind of philosophical, it's a thought experiment without thinking, but what does this look like in reality? So I would hope that the book has a bit of both, this kind of imagining, this kind of aspirational nature, but also, but how does this work? Then if we're going to use particular instruments within the International Criminal Court, for example, or International Humanitarian Law, how would that work? What does that look like? And I've just written another article that's going to be due out in the new journal, Animal Liberation, where I've gone a bit deeper into that particular example of looking at forced pregnancy, for example. And I draw on specific statutes within the International Criminal Court and work through how does that look like then in reality? How would that work? How do they meet the criteria? And some of it still requires imagining, what legal personhood looks like. It still requires drawing on Denier's idea of non-speciesist law, which means that holding non-human animals captive would be illegal. But I think there are ways that you can sort of bring it back to reality and focus on, specific statutes, specific laws, and argue that, once we can accept that non-human animals are sentient, that they should have some passive legal personhood, then then you can make the case to apply some of these protections and laws. And
I completely agree. And you do. You are practical in the book, as well as being thought-provoking in the sense of, hey, let's imagine a different world. I mean, look, if we want to make change, we have to imagine a different world. And we need people to be talking about imagining a different world and how that might work. And where do we start from what we already have, which is really important. And there was another thing you just said that I had never made this connection. When we're talking about the workers in the animal industrial complex, and that's something I do in our book as well. And it's in the context of war. I also thought, well, gosh, a lot of what we're talking about here with respect to workers in the animal industrial complex also goes for the war complex. People who work in, like, soldiers. There's very similar sources of oppression at work and very similar types of trauma and obviously PTSD that we now all know. And all of that, and the profound changes that occur in people who are on battlefields.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And I had never made that connection, so thank you. That when you were mentioning that, and I was thinking about it in the war context, I was like, wow, why that never occurred to me. So thank you again for that. Before we go, are there any projects that you're working on right now that you would like to tell us about, and also tell us about where people might follow your work, whether online or elsewhere?
Hey, thanks, Emmy. So you mentioned earlier the animation that I created for the first book. There is another one on YouTube for this book, and this one is called "Why is the War Against Nonhuman Animals a Crisis for Humans Too?" So people might want to check that out as well, because I think that, again, it's this sort of 1 minute 50 sort of analysis of the book. So there's that. My work is on YouTube in terms of the animations. You can also find me on LinkedIn. You can also find me on my staff webpage, which has got links to the animations and podcasts and open access books and articles. So if you just Google my name, Stacy Banwell at gre.ac.uk, you can find me there. And at the moment, I am currently writing my third book, which is called An Intersectional Analysis of the Relationship Between Climate Change and Atrocity Crimes. Life on Earth is in Crisis. And in that book, I'm also returning to one of the themes that I dealt with in this book, which is the impact of the animal industrial complex. And in that book, I'm taking the argument a little bit further and I'm talking about this idea of rights of nature and how that, alongside legal personhood for non-human animals, forms part of this bigger project around, protecting the non-human world. So there I draw on this idea of adding ecocide to the International Criminal Court. So there are bits from this book that I elaborate on this third one that I'm currently working on. And as I say, there's also the article about rape and sexual violence during the War Against Nonhuman Animals that should be coming out in the first edition of the new journal Animal Liberation. And I think that's in April.
That's fantastic. We might have to have you back.
Yes,
to talk about your third book.
Yes.
This has been fantastic. I really am grateful that you've agreed to come on, and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, Emmy.
Animal activism is often centered on compassion and kindness. I specifically avoid those terms for a number of reasons. Look, it's not like I don't care about compassion or kindness. They're important things to having a world we want to live in. But they don't tell me anything, and they hide what the fundamental issue is with respect to animals. In our society, since the dawn of our agricultural ancestors about 10,000 years ago, we decided we were going to own animals, like we now own a book, a car, or a phone. Because they're property, and property today is only for objects, they have no status. For example, your car and your phone don't have status without you. They can't claim to want to continue to exist if you don't want them to. They can be tossed out, and no one thinks anything more. And animals, either agribusiness animals like pigs, cows, and sheep, or wild animals like swans, whales, or lions, they all belong to someone, whether that's a corporation, an individual, or a state or a nation. As long as we continue to classify animals as objects, as property we can own, there can't be any real transformative change in our relationship with them, or with respect to their rights to autonomously exist and not be exploited. And this has all sorts of knock-on effects, like those identified in Stacy's work. And we must include these types of discussions in our activism because most people don't realize this. It's something most of us never stop and think about. And I hope from now on that you will.
We tear things up when we go round. We burn things up when we go round. We speed things up when we go round and around.
That's it from me, Emmy Leese. Thank you for listening. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com. You can find more of my work and upcoming events on my website, emilialeese.com, and social media. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. And buy a copy of Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks, or request it from your local library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashbacks, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger, a.k.a. Seismicity, on SoundCloud.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.